The year was 1902. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light cutting through the council hall windows as Pastor Jeremiah stood before the town council of Tombstone. His face, usually calm and kind, was now a mask of disbelief, a stark contrast to the smug sneer on Mr. Silas Blackwood's face. Blackwood, a man whose wealth seemed to grow as fast as the desert brush, was a prominent businessman in town, and his voice, dripping with condescension, echoed through the room. "Gentlemen," Blackwood began, his gaze sweeping over the council members before settling on Jeremiah with a look of feigned sorrow. "It pains me deeply to bring such tidings about a man of God, but the truth, as they say, will out." He paused for dramatic effect, then pointed a manicured finger at Jeremiah. "Pastor Jeremiah here has been embezzling church funds, a common thief hiding behind the cloth." A murmur rippled through the small assembly. Jeremiah remained still, his hands clasped before him, a silent sentinel against the rising tide of accusation. Blackwood, emboldened by the council's silence, produced a stack of ledgers. They looked official enough, bound in worn leather, pages filled with neat, incriminating figures. He presented them with a flourish, pushing them across the polished wooden table. "These ledgers," Blackwood declared, his voice now booming with self-righteous indignation, "clearly show discrepancies, funds diverted, and accounts manipulated. Proof, I say, that this man is unfit for his calling, unfit to lead our good people. I demand his immediate expulsion from Tombstone. We cannot allow such corruption to fester in our blessed town." A cold smirk played on Blackwood's lips as he finished, clearly believing he had delivered the final blow. The depth of his calculated malice was chillingly apparent. He didn't just want Jeremiah gone, he wanted him disgraced, broken. But Jeremiah, surprisingly, did not erupt. He didn't shout, didn't plead, didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he calmly unfolded his hands, then refolded them, a subtle movement that spoke volumes. A glint of something unyielding, something akin to steel, appeared in his eyes. He met Blackwood's gaze directly, his voice low but cutting through the sudden silence in the room. "Mr. Blackwood," Jeremiah stated, each word deliberate, "you have sown the wind. Prepare to reap the whirlwind." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The town council members shifted in their seats, their faces etched with a mixture of surprise and unease. They had expected an outburst, a denial, perhaps even tears, but this calm, almost prophetic declaration caught them off guard. They looked at each other, then back at Blackwood, then at Jeremiah. They weren't fully convinced by Blackwood's performance, not after Jeremiah's quiet defiance. A single short phrase seemed to hang in the air, unspoken but understood by some. "Truth finds its own light." Jeremiah turned to leave, his steps unhurried, his posture straight. He reached the doorway, the harsh desert light outlining his silhouette for a moment. He paused there just briefly before stepping out. Over his shoulder, he cast a final, enigmatic glance towards Blackwood, a look that promised consequences. The door swung shut behind him, leaving behind a palpable tension, the heavy silence of an impending storm. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. To understand how things got to that intense meeting, we need to go back a bit, to when Pastor Jeremiah first came to Tombstone. It was 1902, and the Arizona sun beat down relentlessly on the dusty landscape. The town itself was a collection of wooden buildings baked dry by the heat, with saloons and general stores lining the main street. The air always tasted of dust and something else, something wild and untamed, much like the people who lived there. They were a rugged bunch, independent and used to making their own way. They didn't take kindly to outsiders, especially those who came telling them how to live. Jeremiah arrived in a cloud of dust, his buggy rattling down the street. He was a tall man, lean from years of hard work, with kind eyes that seemed to have seen a lot. The town's initial reaction to a new pastor was a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Tombstone had a rough past, full of prospectors hoping to strike it rich, saloon owners carving out their empires, and struggling families just trying to get by. Religion wasn't always at the forefront of their minds, and they'd seen preachers come and go, most of them not lasting long. They were a close-knit community in their own way, but you had to earn their trust. For Jeremiah, coming to Tombstone was more than just a job. It was a fresh start. He carried a quiet sadness with him, a personal loss that had driven him from his previous life. He didn't talk much about it, but the weight of it was always there, a shadow in his past. He sought solace in ministry, a way to find purpose in a world that had felt suddenly empty. His dream was simple, but grand, to build a thriving, honest community here, a beacon of hope in this harsh land. He wanted to help people, to show them a different path, away from the quick money and quick violence that often defined Tombstone. He believed in the power of good, even when things seemed bleak. It wasn't long before he met Sarah, a woman who embodied the quiet strength he admired. Sarah was a widow, raising her young son Thomas alone after her husband's tragic death in a mining accident. She worked hard, her hands calloused, but her spirit remained unbroken. Her faith was deep and unwavering, a steady flame in a town that often felt dark. Jeremiah saw in her the pure spirit he sought to protect, the kind of resilience that could truly build a community. She was one of the first people in town to truly welcome him, offering a warm smile and a few kind words when others just stared. Then there was Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a man who seemed to run everything in Tombstone. He owned the largest general store, had shares in the mines, and seemed to have a hand in every business deal. On the surface, he was benevolent, always ready with a handshake and a word of welcome. He even attended church regularly, sitting in the front pew looking pious. He was among the first to greet Jeremiah, offering support and promising to help the new church get on its feet. Jeremiah initially saw him as a powerful ally, a pillar of the community, but beneath Blackwood's polished exterior lay a controlling nature. He liked things his way, and he liked being the most important man in town. His welcome to Jeremiah felt less like genuine hospitality and more like an assessment, a quiet sizing up of the new pastor. Blackwood had a certain possessiveness over Tombstone, especially its social order. He enjoyed his position at the top, and anyone who might challenge that, even indirectly through moral influence, was watched carefully. Jeremiah, with his genuine desire to help everyone, quickly became someone Blackwood felt he needed to understand and perhaps control. It was a subtle thing at first, a feeling of being under scrutiny, but it was there, setting the stage for the conflict that was to come. The subtle tension that Jeremiah felt from Blackwood slowly started to grow into something more. It wasn't an open fight, not yet, but a constant chipping away at Jeremiah's efforts. Blackwood made sure of it. Jeremiah would announce a new church project, something to help the towns less fortunate, and Blackwood would be the first to offer his support loudly and publicly. He'd promise materials, donations, even his own time. But then, when it came time to deliver, the promises would just disappear. Jeremiah would find himself scrambling, trying to make up for the missing supplies or the promised funds. He'd use his own meager savings or rely on the kindness of others, while Blackwood would act surprised, almost apologetic, claiming a sudden business emergency or a misunderstanding. These broken promises left Jeremiah to shoulder the burden, often making him look disorganized or ineffective to the very people he was trying to help. It was a clever tactic, making Jeremiah appear less capable without Blackwood ever having to openly oppose him. In public, Blackwood would still praise Jeremiah, often in front of other town elders or influential citizens. He'd talk about the pastor's dedication and good intentions. But then, in quieter moments, he'd subtly question Jeremiah's judgment. He'd ask, "Is Pastor Jeremiah perhaps a little too idealistic for Tombstone's practical needs? Or, he means well, but does he truly understand how things work here?" These veiled comments were like tiny poisoned darts, planting seeds of doubt in people's minds. The town elders, who relied on Blackwood for jobs and loans, listened carefully. They might not have fully believed him, but the questions lingered. The manipulation didn't stop there. Jeremiah noticed that whenever he tried to buy supplies for the church's charity work, prices at the local stores, many of which had ties to Blackwood, seemed to mysteriously increase. A sack of flour, a bolt of cloth, even simple tools, everything became just a little more expensive for the church. This made it harder for Jeremiah to help those in need, stretching his already thin resources even further. He saw the frustration in the eyes of the families he was trying to feed and clothe, and he knew it wasn't their fault, but he couldn't prove Blackwood was behind it. Blackwood also tried to sway Sarah's opinion of Jeremiah. He would visit her, ostensibly to check on her well-being or offer help, but then he would gently try to plant doubts. "Pastor Jeremiah is a good man, Sarah, but perhaps a bit naive about the harsh realities of our town," he might say. Or, "He spends so much time on the church, one wonders if he truly understands the needs of a single mother like yourself." He even hinted that Jeremiah's focus on the poor might distract him from the more respectable members of the community, trying to make Sarah feel less important. Sarah, however, saw through his thinly veiled attempts. She knew Jeremiah's heart, and Blackwood's words felt cold and calculating. Tombstone was a town built on hard work and self-reliance, but it also relied heavily on powerful figures like Blackwood for economic stability. He provided jobs, extended credit, and held significant sway in local politics. This meant that even when people suspected Blackwood's motives, they were hesitant to openly challenge him. Their livelihoods, their homes, sometimes even their reputations, depended on staying in his good graces. This societal pressure created a sense of isolation for Jeremiah. He felt the town's unspoken agreement to look the other way, to not rock the boat. It was a heavy weight, knowing that people saw what was happening but felt powerless to act. These accumulated slights, the broken promises, the veiled humiliations, the manipulated prices, and the attempts to turn Sarah against him all showed Jeremiah that Blackwood's public accusation in Part 1 wasn't just a sudden outburst. It was the endpoint of a long, deliberate campaign. Blackwood hadn't just decided to discredit Jeremiah, he had been building towards it for months, slowly, carefully, like a spider weaving a web. The public accusation was simply the final, most visible strand, meant to trap Jeremiah completely and remove him from Tombstone for good. The air in Tombstone started to feel heavy, almost suffocating with tension. It wasn't something you could point to directly, but everyone felt it. Jeremiah certainly did. He felt a net tightening around him, a growing sense of suspicion and isolation that made every interaction feel guarded. The initial warmth he'd felt from some townspeople began to chill, replaced by hesitant glances and hushed conversations whenever he passed. Small disagreements that used to be easy to smooth over within the church council now turned into heated arguments. It was clear that Blackwood's subtle provocations were at play. A suggestion about repairing the church roof, for instance, would suddenly become a debate about Jeremiah's financial management, with Blackwood's allies questioning every estimate, every choice. Jeremiah's sermons, which had once been met with respectful silence and nodding heads, now sometimes had murmurs of dissent from the pews where Blackwood's most loyal supporters sat. He could feel their eyes on him, critical and unwavering, challenging his every word without speaking a sound. Neighbors who had once offered friendly greetings now seemed to avoid his gaze. The whispers started small, then grew louder, spreading through the dusty streets like a tumbleweed in the wind. "Did you hear about Pastor Jeremiah and the church funds?" someone might say, loud enough to be overheard. "They say he's not as honest as he seems." These rumors, baseless as they were, chipped away at his standing in the community, eroding the trust he had worked so hard to build. Even Sarah, who remained a steadfast supporter, felt the pressure. Her own family, worried about her reputation and the future of her son, urged her to distance herself from the troubled pastor. "You have to think about young David, Sarah," her aunt had warned. "Being associated with scandal won't do him any good." Blackwood, sensing his growing advantage, became more open in his disdain. He would often make condescending remarks about Jeremiah in public, not outright insults, but comments designed to belittle and undermine. "Pastor Jeremiah, still dreaming of turning lead into gold, are we?" he might say with a false smile, just loud enough for others to hear, right after Jeremiah had spoken about a new community project. He challenged Jeremiah's authority at every turn, questioning his decisions, his judgment, and even his spiritual guidance. Blackwood also used his financial power to put pressure on anyone who dared to openly support Jeremiah. Merchants who had offered the church fair prices suddenly found their credit lines cut or their orders delayed. Farmers who had donated produce found their loans called in earlier than expected. It was a subtle but effective way to make people choose sides, and many, out of necessity, chose Blackwood's. Jeremiah felt an intense emotional suffocation, the weight of the town's judgment, the constant barrage of Blackwood's machinations, and the growing isolation pressed down on him. Each day felt like he was walking through thick mud, every step an effort. He spent long nights in prayer, questioning his calling, his strength, and his ability to make a difference in Tombstone. He felt trapped, unable to fight back against the unseen enemy that was slowly but surely turning the town against him. This period was the peak of his internal struggle, a dark and heavy time where he felt completely alone before he finally reached his breaking point. The suffocating cycle of suffering which had gripped Jeremiah for so long was about to be shattered by an unexpected turn of events. It began with Sarah's young son, David. David was a quiet boy, often overlooked, but he had a knack for being in places where he wasn't noticed, listening to things he wasn't meant to hear. One afternoon, while playing near the back alley behind Blackwood's general store, he overheard a hushed conversation. Blackwood was speaking in low, urgent tones with one of his associates, a man named Fletcher. David pressed himself against a stack of empty crates, barely breathing. He heard talk of the church land, of old maps, and of mineral rights. Blackwood's voice, usually so smooth and controlled, was tight with excitement. "It's sitting on a fortune, Fletcher, I tell you. Gold, maybe even silver. And that naive pastor, he has no idea what he's sitting on. We just need him out of the way, then the land is ours." The boy didn't understand all the words, but the tone, the urgency, and Blackwood's dark smile sent a shiver down his spine. He heard Blackwood describe how he planned to get control of the church property, how he would force Jeremiah out, and then buy the land for a pittance. Terrified, David ran straight to his mother. Sarah listened, her face growing pale as David, still breathless, recounted what he had heard. The pieces clicked into place, making sense of Blackwood's relentless campaign against Jeremiah. It wasn't about piety or community, it was about greed. Her unwavering faith in Jeremiah, which had wavered under the town's pressure, solidified instantly. This was the truth she had instinctively known was there. Armed with this devastating revelation, Sarah sought out Jeremiah immediately. She found him in the quiet solitude of the church, looking worn and defeated. She sat beside him, and in a voice filled with a mixture of anger and renewed determination, told him everything David had overheard. Jeremiah listened, his eyes widening with each detail, a cold fury slowly replacing the weariness in his expression. It was a moment of profound clarity. They decided then and there to expose Blackwood, to fight back with the truth. At the same time, Blackwood, growing impatient with Jeremiah's stubborn presence, made a move that, ironically, began to expose him to the wider town. He publicly announced his intention to donate a large sum of money to the church. The offer was generous, almost too generous. But there was a condition. Jeremiah had to step down immediately, and Blackwood would then appoint a new, more amenable pastor, someone who would align with his vision for the community. This blatant attempt to control the church and its leadership, disguised as philanthropy, was a step too far for many. Even some who had been swayed by Blackwood's charm began to see through his thinly veiled agenda. The talk shifted from Jeremiah's alleged misdeeds to Blackwood's heavy-handed tactics. Then, an unexpected opportunity arrived. An old prospector named Jedediah, a grizzled man with a long beard and eyes that had seen too many sunrises, approached Jeremiah. Jedediah had been a good friend of Sarah's late husband and had always held Jeremiah in high regard. He had heard the rumors, and he had seen Blackwood's play before. "Pastor," Jedediah rasped, pulling a rolled-up, brittle piece of parchment from his worn satchel. "Found this among your wife's things after she passed. Always meant to give it to you. It was an old deed, yellowed with age." This deed, Jedediah explained, proved the church's land ownership extended beyond what Blackwood believed, encompassing not just the main building, but also a small, almost forgotten plot a little ways out of town. On that plot stood a dilapidated, overgrown chapel, the true original church of Tombstone, long abandoned. And within that chapel, Jedediah hinted, there was a secret, a hidden history that Blackwood knew nothing about. This combination of David's revelation, Sarah's renewed courage, Blackwood's overreach, and Jedediah's unexpected discovery fundamentally shifted everything. The narrative moved from passive suffering to active resistance, from quiet despair to the promise of exposure. The fight was on. Jeremiah felt an emotional storm brewing inside him. Doubt gnawed at the edges, a cold knot of fear tightening in his stomach. But beneath it all, a surge of righteous anger began to burn, hotter and stronger than the fear. The weight of potential failure, of letting down Sarah and her boy, of seeing Blackwood win, pressed down on him like a physical burden. He was just one man, a pastor, not a fighter in the way Tombstone understood fighting. He had always believed in peace, in turning the other cheek, but this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about justice, about the truth, about the soul of this town he had come to love. He walked the dusty streets late into the night, the revelation from David, Sarah's courageous stance, and Jedediah's old deeds swirling in his mind. He acknowledged his own human frailties, the moments of weakness, the times he had almost given in to Blackwood's pressure. He was scared, yes, but he also knew deep down that he couldn't back down now. This fight was bigger than any personal comfort or fear. He resolved to fight, not with fists or threats, but with the undeniable power of truth. Sarah, her quiet strength now fully unleashed, became Jeremiah's staunchest ally. Her eyes, once clouded with worry, now held a fierce determination. She spent hours with Jeremiah, recounting every detail David had heard, every subtle manipulation Blackwood had employed against them. Her son, David, though still timid after his frightening discovery, found his voice when speaking about his desire for Blackwood to be stopped. He drew crude maps of the church land, pointing out where he had seen Blackwood and his men snooping around. Jedediah, the old prospector, proved to be an invaluable resource. He knew the land, its history, and more importantly, he knew Blackwood's kind. He provided crucial support not just with his knowledge of the old deed and the forgotten chapel, but with his quiet, unwavering belief in Jeremiah. He would sit on the church steps, whittling wood, a silent guardian. The town, however, remained a volatile landscape of shifting loyalties. Some residents, initially swayed by Blackwood's outward piety and financial influence, began to question him openly. His public attempt to buy the church's leadership had backfired, making many uneasy. They saw the thinly veiled greed beneath the veneer of generosity. Whispers started circulating not about Jeremiah's supposed misdeeds, but about Blackwood's overreach. Yet others, deeply indebted to Blackwood for loans, jobs, or favors, clung even tighter to his side. They spread new rumors, painting Jeremiah as a troublemaker, ungrateful, and even dangerous. The division in Tombstone became palpable, a tangible tension in the air. People avoided eye contact, conversations died when Jeremiah walked by, and allegiances shifted daily like desert sands. The town's inherent suspicion of outsiders, a relic of its Wild West past, made Jeremiah's position even more precarious, and its deep-seated respect for property rights, a cornerstone of any frontier settlement, meant that any challenge to land ownership was a serious matter. This complex environment made every step forward feel like navigating a minefield. Jeremiah experienced a profound psychological shift during this time. The initial shock of Blackwood's treachery had given way to a steely determination. His faith, once a quiet comfort, now blazed within him, a guiding light. The unwavering support of Sarah, David, and Jedediah solidified his resolve. He realized this fight wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about protecting the innocent, upholding truth, and fighting for the very soul of Tombstone itself. He was no longer just a pastor, he was a shepherd guarding his flock against a wolf. Jeremiah, now fully committed, began the arduous process of clearing his name and exposing Blackwood. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had a compelling story and solid evidence. With Sarah by his side, her testimony clear and unwavering, and David's brave account of what he'd overheard, they started to piece together the truth. Jedediah, the old prospector, brought the final, crucial piece, the long-forgotten deed. This document, carefully preserved, proved beyond a doubt that the church's land, including the small, dilapidated chapel Blackwood coveted, rightfully belonged to the community. The day Jeremiah presented his case to the town council was tense. The room was packed, a mix of curious onlookers, Blackwood's loyalists, and those who had quietly hoped for his downfall. Jeremiah spoke calmly, detailing Blackwood's deceit and fraudulent schemes. He laid out the fabricated ledgers, then presented the real ones, painstakingly recreated with Sarah's help. He explained how Blackwood had manipulated prices, spread rumors, and attempted to coerce him into abandoning his flock. Sarah then spoke, her voice quiet but firm, recounting Blackwood's attempts to turn her against Jeremiah and how her son's discovery had opened her eyes to the true extent of his greed. David, though small, stood before the council and with a shaky voice told them exactly what he'd heard Blackwood say about the mineral rights and the church land. Jedediah then stepped forward, unfolding the ancient deed. He pointed to the faded script, explaining how the original settlers had dedicated the land, including the old chapel, to the community's spiritual well-being, long before Blackwood or even his father had arrived. The old chapel, once a forgotten ruin, suddenly became a powerful symbol of Tombstone's true foundation, its forgotten history, and the truth Blackwood had tried to bury. Faced with this irrefutable evidence, Blackwood's carefully constructed empire began to crumble. The council, though initially hesitant to challenge such a powerful figure, could not ignore the facts. Investigations into Blackwood's other financial dealings quickly followed. They uncovered a history of corruption, shady land deals, and exploitation that had long been hidden beneath his veneer of respectability. The town, once under his thumb, turned against him with a vengeance. The whispers that had once targeted Jeremiah now swirled around Blackwood, growing louder and more damning. As justice unfolded, a new sign appeared in Tombstone. It wasn't a grand monument, but a humble, beautifully carved wooden cross erected near the old chapel. It bore a simple inscription, dedicated to truth and community spirit. This sign, paid for by the repentant townspeople, stood in stark contrast to Blackwood's former dominance. It symbolized Tombstone's collective awakening, a commitment to integrity over greed. Blackwood, stripped of his influence and wealth, was forced to leave Tombstone in disgrace, his reputation in tatters. His departure marked the end of an era, a dark shadow lifted from the town. Jeremiah, though weary from the fight, found his faith renewed and his position in the community solidified. He was no longer just the new pastor, he was a respected spiritual leader, a shepherd who had protected his flock. The story of Tombstone concluded, not with a dramatic shootout, but with a quiet triumph of spirit. Jeremiah often reflected on the arduous journey, the resilience of the human spirit he had witnessed, and the enduring power of truth and genuine community in even the harshest of environments. Tombstone, scarred by its ordeal but stronger for having faced it, began a new chapter, guided by integrity and a faith that had been tested and proven true.